Welcome to this week's segment of Around the World. My name is Pooja. It is said that the best foreign policy is the policy which promotes the national interest of a country. It is often seen that a country establishes bilateral relations with its rival countries as well. All the grievances, debates and ideologies are set aside when it comes to national interest. Recently, this trend has been observed in the attitude of the Middle East countries. It seems that their stance towards Israel is changing in the last 2 to 3 years. Some Arab countries are now making efforts to establish diplomatic relations with Israel after years of sidelining Israel diplomatically. For decades, Israel was sidelined by all the Arab countries except Egypt and Jordan. Most of the Arab countries avoided having any formal diplomatic relations with Israel due to the Israel-Palestine conflict. But now, when the oil-based economy of almost all the Arab countries has become dilapidated due to the COVID pandemic, they have realized that they need to diversify their economy. On the other hand, Iran presents many challenges to the Arab countries. Therefore, they need allies to deal with Iran. To achieve this end, they have not only restored diplomatic and security relations with Israel at the cost of the Palestinian issue, but also expanded its scope rapidly. At present, this scope has expanded up to a free trade agreement along with the formation of the security group Quad. The United Arab Emirates signed a free trade agreement with Israel last week after just 4 rounds of meeting. This is Israel's first free trade agreement with the Arab state. With this, UAE has become the first Arab country to enter into a free trade agreement with Israel. The UAE was also the first Gulf country to normalize relations with Israel. This relationship was restored in 2020 through the Abraham Accord, which was mediated by the US. In such a scenario, one pertinent question arises that what is the Abraham Accord and how is it related to Israel and Arab countries? Another major question is that what is the purpose of UAE-Israel Free Trade Agreement and how this agreement will impact the Arab countries? And the final question is that how the UAE-Israel Free Trade Agreement will affect India. We will discuss all these issues in today's story. But first of all, let us discuss about Israel and the UAE. The United Arab Emirates is a West Asian country. It is located at the eastern end of the Arabian Peninsula. It shares its land borders with Oman and Saudi Arabia, while it shares maritime borders with Qatar and Iran in the Persian Gulf. Abu Dhabi is its capital, while Dubai is its most populous city. It is an elective monarchy with a union of 7 emirates, which include Abu Dhabi, Ajman, Dubai, Fujairah, Ras Al Khaimah, Sharjah and Al Quwain. However, Emirates is governed by an emir. Together, these emirs form the Supreme Council of the Union. The members of the Supreme Council elect the President and the Prime Minister from amongst themselves. As per the convention, the Emir of Abu Dhabi serves as the President while the Emir of Dubai serves as the Prime Minister of the UAE. Whereas Israel is the only Jewish country in modern times. The region, which currently falls within its boundaries, has a long and rich history. However, in present times, it remains a major center of controversy in the Middle East. Israel is a Middle Eastern country which is located on the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. It's bordered by Lebanon to the north, Syria to the northeast, Jordan to the east and southeast, Egypt to the southwest, and the Mediterranean Sea to the west. It also borders the Gulf of Aqaba to some extent in the south. Israel claims Jerusalem as its capital. However, its claim has not been recognized yet by most countries of the world because they consider it as a part of Palestine. Palestine is a Muslim-majority country bordering Israel. Israel occupied the western half of the Palestinian capital city of Jerusalem during the Arab-Israel War in the 1940s. While Jordan occupied the eastern part of Jerusalem later, Israel also occupied the eastern part of Jerusalem and expanded its settlement in the region. The dispute which started with Jerusalem has now become a question of identity and land. However, countries like Egypt and Qatar are engaged in resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict through talks. While the US also took initiative like the Abraham Accords for normalizing the relations of the rest of the Arab countries with Israel, and the US efforts seem to be yielding positive results. Now the question arises that what is the Abraham Accord? How is it related to Israel and Arab countries, and what role has the US played in this accord? The US-mediated Abraham Accord is a peace agreement. It's a peace initiative for normalizing relations with Israel and the rest of the Arab countries. Its strings are attached to the Arab-Israel War. When the Arab countries suffered a collective defeat in the Arab-Israel War, then these countries refrained from recognizing Israel. Later, Egypt normalized its relations with Israel by striking a peace deal through the US mediation. Later, Jordan also recognized Israel, and as its result, mutual relations between both the countries were restored. However, the attitude of rest of the Arab countries towards Israel did not change until 2020. In 2020, the Abraham Accord was signed between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain through the Trump administration mediation. Through this accord, the UAE and Bahrain established diplomatic relations with Israel. Later, Morocco and Sudan also signed the Abraham Accord. At present, the main threat to the UAE and its allies is not Israel but the expansionist Iran and international political Islamists. Israel also shares similar concerns and it is also considered as an important regional power. Moreover, the US is also strategically closer to Israel. Therefore, establishing a better strategic relationship with Israel has become more important than holding on to the Palestine issue. Now, you may ask that how the UAE-Israel Free Trade Agreement will impact the Arab countries. The UAE and Israel stated that under this agreement, the duty will be removed on 96% of the goods being traded between the two countries within the next 5 years. Israel claims that the bilateral trade between the two countries was $885 million in 2021. After the agreement, the annual value of the trade is estimated to increase to $10 billion within the next 5 years. It will boost the economy of both the countries. It will accelerate growth, generate employment, and lead to a new era of peace, stability, and prosperity in the region. It would inspire the rest of the countries to have a strong economic relationship with Israel. However, the Palestinian issue will become secondary due to this agreement. It will transform the economic condition as well as the political direction of the Middle East in today's era of globalization. In such a scenario, it cannot be ruled out that this agreement will not affect India. Now you may ask that what will be the impact of this agreement on India? UAE is a major trading partner of India. The UAE is second in terms of both the exports made from India and the imports made in India. India's exports to UAE will decline due to this agreement, as now the UAE can import Israeli goods at a much cheaper rate than Indian goods. However, India has also signed a free trade agreement with the UAE in February 2022. Under this agreement, duty has been abolished on 90% of the goods exported by India to the UAE. In such a scenario, the impact of the UAE-Israel Free Trade Agreement on India is likely to have a limited impact. The UAE has recently held talks with Indonesia and South Korea for signing similar agreements. It will be interesting to see whether all these agreements will succeed in transforming the political and economic equations of the Middle East or not. Now we will discuss some other important international news. Russia, which is facing Western sanctions due to the Russia-Ukraine war, has now started looking for new markets in African and Asian countries. Last week, Russian President Vladimir Putin held a meeting with the African Union chief Macky Sall for discussing grain supplies and political cooperation. The current president of the African Union, Macky Sall, is the incumbent president of Senegal. At present, grain prices have skyrocketed in the world's poorest continent, Africa. The grain prices have skyrocketed in Africa due to the decline in exports from Ukraine, immense effects of conflicts and climate change, and fears of social unrest. The oil producer organization OPEC Plus has agreed to increase crude oil production by 50% for the coming months amidst rising crude oil prices. Crude oil prices have risen sharply these days due to supply disruptions owing to the Russian-Ukraine war. Therefore, various major oil consumer countries, including the US, were pressurizing the OPEC Plus for organization for increasing oil production. OPEC Plus is the single largest organization of oil-producing countries, having 23 members. It accounts for 55% of the global oil production and over 90% of the oil storage. Recently, Australia's new Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, visited the Pacific island country of Samoa and Tonga for re-establishing its relations with the Pacific countries. During this visit, he emphasized on tackling the current threat of climate change and the deepening cultural and sporting ties. The Chinese Foreign Minister had also visited Samoa and Tonga just a few days ago. Australia and China are competing for regional dominance along with New Zealand in the Pacific region. Algeria has decided to distance itself from Spain's decade-old friendship because Spain has supported Morocco on the Western Sahara issue. Western Sahara is a bone of contention between Algeria and Morocco. At present, about 80% of the Western Sahara is under Morocco's control. The rest of Western Sahara is under the control of the Algerian-backed Polisario movement. In recent days, Morocco has offered limited autonomy to Western Sahara, and Morocco's offer was publicly supported by Spain. Spain's support for Morocco's offer has irked Algeria. Spain is completely dependent on Algeria for its natural gas supply. The Czech Republic, an Eastern European country, is considering withdrawal from China's 16+1 investment club for Central and Eastern Europe, citing unfulfilled promises. Following the recommendations of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the government of the Czech Republic unanimously passed a resolution to withdraw from the 16+1 club. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs considers that China has made limited investment in the Czech Republic under the 16+1 club despite making major promises. Unfulfilled promises have prompted the Czech Republic to reconsider its participation in the 16+1 club. This club is a system for China's economic diplomacy in Central and Eastern Europe. Let us also look at today's question. The Israel-UAE Free Trade Agreement has the potential to change the political and economic landscape of the Middle East. Analyze.